The rusted trap the forest was quiet. Too quiet, not a single bird sang. Not even the wind dared to move through the twisted black trees. The air was heavy with the smell of rust and old blood. A smell that clung to the ground like a shadow, lures. Breathing was fast, sharp, and shallow. Her hands were pressed against the cold metal bars that curved over her. Trapping her inside, the trap was huge, made from ancient steel and alien alloys, covered in patches of green moss and red-brown. Corrosion? It looked like it had been waiting here for hundreds of years, waiting for something. Or someone, beside her. Sci-Fi struggled against the thick, jagged spikes that pinned her left leg to the ground every time she tried to move. The old springs groaned, the sound like a deep growl from the earth itself. Blood trickled slowly down her skin, but she didn't cry out. They both knew that if the trap sensed too much movement, it might trigger again and finish what it started. The two alien women whispered to each other in their own language. Their voices were soft, trembling. Carrying fear and sorrow, they spoke of their families. Of the home they might never see again, they spoke of the cold, of the way the metal seemed to drink the heat from their bodies. And then they spoke of goodbye, because they both knew they might not live until morning. The poison on the spikes was already making their limbs heavy, their vision blur. Sci-Fi squeezed Laura's hand, her lips trembling as she whispered, "It is better to go together." Laura closed her eyes and nodded, a tear rolling down her dirt-covered cheek. Then, somewhere deep in the trees, they heard it, a sound faint at first, a crunch of leaves, a snap of a twig, the rhythm of footsteps. Slow but steady. It was not the heavy, uneven walk of a predator. It was lighter, more deliberate. Almost cautious, but it was coming closer. Closer with each breath they took. The women froze, their eyes darting toward the darkness. Was it another trapper, a scavenger looking for easy prey? Or worse, one of the human hunters they had been warned about since childhood. Humans, they had been told, were clever and ruthless. They captured what they found and sold it to the highest bidder. They were the kind of danger you could not see until it was too late. The footsteps grew louder. Now, accompanied by the sound of fabric brushing against bark, something metallic clinked, faint but clear. Laura's heart pounded, each beat echoing in her ears. She tried to peer through the thick vines that draped over the trap's frame. For a moment, she saw nothing but shadow and movement. Then he stepped into view, a tall figure in a weather-worn jacket. His face half hidden under a hood. The light that filtered through the treetops touched his features just enough for them to see he was human. His eyes scanned the trap, lingering on the two women inside. His expression was unreadable, but his brows drew together slightly, a sign of surprise, maybe even concern. Neither Laura nor Sci-Fi spoke. They didn't know what to say, and they doubted he would understand them anyway. They simply stared, their breath shallow, their muscles tense. The human took a slow step forward, then another. The sound of his boots on the damp earth was the only thing in the world they could hear. He stopped a few feet away, crouching to examine the trap. His gloved fingers brushed away some of the vines and moss, revealing the strange markings etched into the steel. The women's eyes followed every movement. He traced the edge of the locking mechanism, tilting his head like someone trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he looked up at them. His voice was low, almost careful, as he said something. In his language, they didn't understand the words, but the tone. The tone wasn't hostile. Still, they didn't answer. They had heard enough stories to know kindness could be a mask. The human's gaze lingered for a moment. Then he shifted his bag from his shoulder. They could see the hilt of a tool, maybe a weapon sticking out. Laura tightened her grip on Sci-Fi's hand. If he reached for it, they would fight, even if they had no chance. Sci-Fi leaned closer to Laura's ear and whispered, "If he means to kill us, let's not give him the pleasure." The air between them was heavy, every heartbeat stretching the silence. The human reached into his bag slowly. The women tensed, bracing for the worst, and then he pulled out something small, not a weapon, but a tool. A tool meant to cut through metal, and in that moment, for the first time, they wondered if, maybe, just maybe, the footsteps they had heard were not the sound of death, but the sound of hope walking toward them. Evan knelt by the edge of the trap, his shadow falling over the two alien women, up close. They could see the faint lines of exhaustion on his face, the smudges of dirt on his cheek. His clothes were patched in places, showing a man who had traveled far, maybe for days without rest. The hood slipped slightly, revealing short dark hair and eyes that seemed to study everything. Those eyes moved from the spikes to the locks, to the faint streaks of blood on Cerise's leg. They were not the cold eyes of a hunter looking at prey, but the searching eyes of someone weighing a choice. Laura shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. She had heard that humans were quick to make deals, to trade lives for profit. This one could easily sell them to a slave caravan. Or worse, Cerise's fingers tightened around hers, as if silently asking her to stay quiet. The human glanced at their joined hands and then back at the trap. His lips pressed into a thin line, the kind of look that said he had already made up his mind about something. He placed his bag down gently, as though not to alarm them. From it, he pulled a small device, flat and square. With blinking blue lights along the edge, it gave a faint hum, and Laura instinctively flinched away. The human paused and looked at her, tilting his head slightly. Then, in slow, clear words, he said, "Help." Help, tapping his chest and then pointing at them. The words were foreign, but the tone and gestures made their meaning hard to mistake. Still, the women said nothing. Their bodies tense, Cerise's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Trust was not something you gave to a stranger in the forest, especially not a human. Evan, undeterred, moved closer to the lock and began scanning it with the device. A soft blue light washed over the corroded metal, highlighting cracks and weakened joints. The trap responded with a sharp metallic groan. One of the rusted hinges shifted slightly, sending a shiver through the frame. The women froze, fearing the sudden movement might trigger the spikes again. Evan seemed to notice their fear. Glancing at them briefly before returning to his work, he pulled a small pry bar from his belt and wedged it under a locking plate. The metal resisted, creaking and snapping in protest. Minutes passed like hours. The forest around them was still, except for the occasional distant call of some unseen bird. Sweat began to bead on Evan's forehead as he worked. The lock was stubborn, the years of rust making it nearly impossible to move. He gritted his teeth, muttering something under his breath. Finally, with a sharp crack, a piece of the lock gave way, but the rest still held firm. Cerise's breathing grew heavier. The poison from the spikes was working its way through her body faster now. Her skin had taken on a faint, unnatural sheen. Evan noticed and frowned. He said something quickly, pointing to her leg, then rummaged in his bag again. From it, he pulled a small vial of clear liquid, holding it up for them to see. Laura recognized it instantly. Human medicine. She had heard of its power, how it could stop venom if given in time, but she also knew that accepting anything from a human was dangerous still. She saw Cerise's lips turning pale, her strength fading. With a tight jaw, she gave a small nod. Evan uncorked the vial, poured the contents onto the wound, and pressed a cloth over it. Cerise hissed in pain, her nails digging into Laura's arm, but the burning sensation began to fade within moments. Her breathing steadied, and some color returned to her cheeks. Evan allowed himself a small, quick smile before returning to the lock. That smile caught Laura off guard. It wasn't the smile of someone expecting payment. It was the kind of smile you gave when you were simply glad someone might live. Still, questions churned in her mind. Why was he helping them? Why risk angering whoever had set this trap? And what would he want in return once they were free? She glanced at Sarai, who seemed equally puzzled but too weak to speak. The forest was quiet again, but not for long. Somewhere in the distance, a sound echoed, low and deep. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl. The growl of something large. Evan's head snapped up, eyes scanning the trees. The growl came again. Closer this time, followed by the rustle of heavy footsteps. Whatever it was coming straight toward them. Lura's pulse quickened, her gaze darting between the human and the shadows. Evan's jaw tightened. He stood and drew a small blaster from his belt, keeping his other hand on the trap. His voice was calm but firm as he said something neither of them understood. Still, his stance made his meaning clear. He was not leaving. The growl was now joined by a wet, snarling breath. Leaves shook, branches cracked, and the shadows moved. And then the beast stepped into the clearing. Its eyes gleamed like molten gold, its body massive and rippling with muscle. It lowered its head, teeth bared, and fixed its gaze on the trapped women. Evan stepped between them and the creature, his blaster raised. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The trap creaked softly, as if holding its own breath. Whatever happened next would decide whether any of them walked out of this forest alive. The beast's roar shook the air. Birds burst from the treetops in a panicked cloud, their cries echoing through the dark forest. Laura's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. Sarai's breathing was shallow, her fingers clutching at the bars of the trap as if she could pull herself free by will alone. Evan stood his ground, his blaster aimed steady at the monster's glowing eyes. The creature took a step forward, its claws sinking deep into the wet soil. Its breath came out in hot bursts, the smell of rot and meat thick in the air. Evan fired a warning shot, the blue bolt hissing past the beast's head and striking a tree. The animal recoiled for only a moment before growling even deeper. It wasn't afraid, it was angry. The human glanced back at the two alien women for the briefest moment. His jaw clenched as if making a decision he didn't have time to think about. Without turning his back on the predator, he shifted closer to the trap and crouched, the pry bar in his left hand, the blaster in his right. He was going to try both, defend them and free them at the same time. "Don't," Sarai rasped, her voice weak but urgent. She didn't know if he understood, but she had to try. This trap. Dangerous, she managed, pointing at the thick, corroded spring coiled above them. Evan just shook his head without looking at her. "Not leaving you," he said, in slow, broken words. The beast lunged suddenly, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Evan dropped to one knee, firing at its leg. The bolt burned through skin and muscle, sending the creature crashing to the side with a pained roar. It rolled and scrambled up again, limping but still furious. Evan turned his attention back to the lock, wedging the pry bar deeper. Metal screamed in protest. Rust crumbled away in flakes. Falling like dead leaves, the first hinge gave a violent jolt, sending a shiver through the whole structure. Lura and Sarai gasped, their bodies tense. One wrong move could send the spikes slamming down. The beast circled now, its golden eyes never leaving them. Evan's breathing was faster, sweat dripping into his eyes. He forced the bar deeper, muscles straining. Finally, there was a loud crack. One section of the trap's locking plate snapped loose. The sound seemed to enrage the predator, which roared and charged again. Evan spun around just in time. This time, he fired 3 quick shots, 2 to the ground near its paws. One grazing its shoulder, the creature skidded to a halt, snarling. It was smart enough to know it couldn't attack without risk, but stubborn enough not to leave. The standoff continued, each second stretching painfully long. Evan turned back to the trap. The second lock was even more stubborn, its bolts fused. into a single lump of rust and old steel. He tried the pry bar again, but it wouldn't budge. His eyes darted to the plasma cutter in his bag. He dropped the pry bar, grabbed the cutter, and ignited it with a hiss. The beam of light cut through the corroded metal slowly. The smell of burning rust filled the air. Laura flinched as sparks rained down near her arm. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Sarai's eyes were fixed on the beast. Ready to scream a warning if it moved again, the plasma cutter's hum grew louder as Evan pressed harder. The lock began to glow red, then orange. Finally, with a dull snap, it broke apart, falling to the ground with a heavy clunk. The whole trap shuddered, the bars loosening just enough for Sarai to slip her leg free. She staggered out, limping badly, but alive. Evan quickly shifted to Laura's side. The third lock was the smallest, but it was jammed tighter than the others. The beast growled low, its patience running thin. Evan kept working, his back to the predator, trusting his ears to warn him if it moved. Laura watched him closely, her chest tight with something she didn't want to name. Not yet. A sudden crash of branches signaled the beast's final charge. Evan didn't turn. Instead, he reached blindly for his blaster and fired over his shoulder. The bolt hit the ground right in front of the monster's face, exploding dirt and leaves. The beast stopped mid-step, shaking its head in frustration. It let out a long, warning growl, then slowly began to back away into the shadows. Evan didn't relax until the sound of its footsteps faded into the distance. He returned his focus to the last lock with one final push of the cutter. The metal split apart. Laura fell forward into his arms as the trap's bars swung open. Her knees buckled, and he caught her easily. For a moment, neither spoke. They just breathed the sound of life after too close a brush with death. Evan's voice was soft when he finally said, "You're free." Laura looked up at him, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached for Sarai, pulling her close. The human stepped back, giving them space, but his eyes kept scanning the forest. The danger wasn't gone, not yet, and somewhere deep inside, they all knew this rescue had just begun. The forest was silent again, but it was not the silence of safety. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the ears. Warning of danger still close by. Laura leaned against the trap's twisted remains, her legs trembling from weakness and pain. Sarai stood beside her, favoring her injured leg, but gripping a broken piece of metal like a weapon. Evan's eyes swept the tree line, every muscle in his body tense. A faint rustle came from the undergrowth, too steady to be the wind. Evan raised his blaster, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The sound grew louder, a deep, steady crunch of leaves and snapping twigs. A shape moved in the shadows, tall and broad, weaving between the trees. Then, glint of molten gold shone in the darkness. The beast stepped into the clearing. It was massive, its head nearly reaching Evan's shoulder, even at a crouch. Its skin was thick and scaled in some places, covered with coarse black fur in others. Two long tusks curled out from its lower jaw. Glistening with saliva, its golden eyes locked instantly onto the women, ignoring Evan as if he were just another. Obstacles. Sarai's grip on her makeshift weapon tightened. Laura's breathing quickened, but she didn't move. She knew sudden motion could trigger the predator's attack. Evan, however, took a deliberate step forward. Placing himself directly between the beast and the women, the creature's lips curled back, revealing teeth as sharp as knives. A low rumble rolled from its throat, vibrating in the air. Evan didn't fire immediately. He knew better than to waste shots. Instead, he crouched slightly, keeping his blaster level with the beast's head. His free hand reached behind him, motioning for the women to move slowly backward. But the trap's wreckage made that nearly impossible. The beast took a slow step forward, testing him, Evan took one in return, refusing to yield ground. For a long, tense moment, predator and human stared each other down. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a roar that shook the ground, the beast charged. Evan fired twice, the blue bolts striking the beast's shoulder and chest. The shots slowed it, but didn't stop it. It swiped at him with a clawed paw the size of a shield. Evan ducked low, rolling to the side and firing again. Into its flank, the smell of scorched fur filled the air. The beast spun, its massive tail lashing out and smashing into the trap's remains. The impact sent shards of rusted metal flying in all directions. One piece grazed Laura's arm, leaving a thin line of blood. Sci-Fi yanked her closer. Shielding her as best she could, Evan was already back on his feet, circling to keep the beast's attention on him. Go. He barked, the one word sharp and urgent, even without knowing his language. The women understood. They began edging toward the far side of the clearing, moving as fast as their injuries allowed. But the beast noticed, its golden eyes snapping. Toward them, it shifted its weight, preparing to lunge. Evan reacted instantly. He aimed for its face this time, firing a bolt that scorched the ground just in front of its nose. The blast made the creature recoil with a startled snarl. It shook its head violently, as if trying to clear the flash from its vision, that gave the women precious seconds to move farther away. But the beast recovered fast. It turned on Evan again, this time rushing with terrifying speed. Evan fired. Until the blaster's charge light blinked red. Empty, he cursed under his breath and dropped the weapon. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a small, grenade-like device. The beast leaped at him just as he threw it. The device exploded in a blinding flash of white light and a piercing sound that rattled the teeth. The predator screamed, staggering. Backward, it clawed at its own face, blinded and disoriented. Evan didn't waste the chance. He ran to the women, grabbing Laura's arm to steady her. Move, he said firmly. Half pulling them toward the tree line, they stumbled over roots. And under low branches, their breaths ragged behind them. The beast's roars faded into frustrated snarls, but none of them believed it would give up entirely. It would wait, it would follow, and it would strike again when it thought they were weak. They didn't stop moving until the shadows grew thicker, and the clearing was far behind them. Evan finally slowed, listening for any sign of pursuit. Only the faint rustle of leaves answered. The women leaned against a tree, gasping for air. Evan kept his blaster in hand, despite it being empty. A bluff, but sometimes that was enough. Laura met his eyes for the first time since they'd been freed. You. Why? She asked in halting words. Evan didn't answer right away. He simply glanced back toward the clearing, scanning for movement. Then he said quietly, "No one should die like that." The words hung between them. Sci-Fi looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. They all knew the danger wasn't over. But for now, they had survived, and in the forest, survival was everything. They moved through the forest in silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp leaves and the faint metallic taints of blood. Evan stayed in front, scanning the shadows for any sign of the beast returning. Behind him, Laura and Sci-Fi struggled to keep pace, their injuries slowing them every few steps. Sci-Fi winced as her injured leg brushed against a branch. Finally, they reached a small hollow between two massive tree roots. It was hidden from view, dark enough to feel almost safe. Evan motioned for them to sit. They lowered themselves onto the damp ground, breathing hard. The tension in the air slowly gave way to exhaustion. Laura rubbed her wrists, feeling the deep grooves left by the trap's restraints. The cold bite of the metal was gone, but the memory of it clung stubbornly to her skin. Sci-Fi leaned back against the roots, her eyes half closed. She had been strong for hours, but the venom had taken its toll. Her breathing was uneven and her skin felt too warm. Evan crouched beside her without a word. He rummaged through his bag and pulled out a small case of tools. Laura's eyes narrowed, unsure of what he was doing. Then she saw it. The last piece of the trap still clamped around Sarai's ankle. It was a thick metal cuff, locked in place. With a mechanism older than any of them, Sarai tried to shift her leg away. But Evan shook his head slowly. He pointed to the cuff, then to his tools, then to himself. "I fix," he said in his rough, slow speech. The words were simple, but the intent was clear. Sarai hesitated, then gave a small nod. Evan took out a tiny cutting torch and lit it. A thin flame hissed, bathing the cuff in a faint orange glow. The heat made Sarai flinch, but he worked carefully. Sparks fell harmlessly to the ground as he sliced through the centuries-old lock. Every cut made the cuff weaker, the smell of scorched metal mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. Laura watched closely, her mind spinning. Why was he still helping them? He had already risked his life against the beast, already freed them from the trap. He could have left them to their fate. But here he was, still fighting for their freedom. She wasn't used to this kind of persistence, not from a human. The lock finally gave way with a sharp snap. Evan set the broken cuff aside and moved to check Sarai's wound. He unwrapped the cloth from earlier. Inspecting the skin beneath, the swelling had gone down. But the skin was still tender and bruised. He applied a thin layer of a gel from his medkit, the scent sharp and mint-like. Sarai sighed softly as the pain dulled. She looked at him with an expression that was almost disbelief. In her world, kindness was rarely given without a price. But he didn't ask for anything. Not a word about payment, not a hint of demand. Only the quiet focus of someone who had decided this was simply the right thing to do. Laura's own ankles still bore the marks of the trap's grip, Evan noticed, and motioned for her to come closer. She hesitated, then stepped forward and sat in front of him. The cuff around her right leg was even more corroded than Sarai's had been. It had fused in places, making the removal harder. He worked slowly, pausing every so often to let the heat fade. She felt the warmth of the flame and the faint vibration of the metal under his hands. It was strange, this close, she could hear his breathing, steady and calm despite everything. She found herself studying the lines of his face, the dirt smudged across his cheek. His eyes stayed fixed on the cuff, his focus unshaken. The second lock broke at last, falling away with a dull clink. Laura flexed her ankle, feeling the first real freedom in hours. She murmured something in her own language, a quiet thank you. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He gave her a small nod before packing away his tools. For a moment, the hollow felt almost peaceful. The distant sounds of the forest returned, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint hum of insects, but they all knew it wouldn't last. The beast was still out there, and the trap's owner might come looking. Evan looked up toward the treetops, as if gauging how much daylight they had left. He pointed in a direction and spoke a few quick words. The women didn't understand, but his meaning was clear. They had to move. Sarai struggled to her feet. Leaning on Laura for support, Evan slung his bag over his shoulder and took the lead once again. The chains were broken, but the danger had not been left behind. The forest seemed endless. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow stretched long and dark. The air was damp, and the ground squelched under their steps. Evan moved ahead with quick but careful strides, his eyes scanning for danger. Laura and Sarai followed close behind, their injuries slowing them but not stopping them. Sarai's leg still ached with every step. Laura kept an arm around her waist to help her walk. The human glanced back often, making sure they hadn't fallen too far behind. When Sarai stumbled on a root, he was there in an instant, steadying her without a word. His hands were steady, his grip strong, but his touch was careful, almost gentle. They walked for what felt like hours. The sounds of the forest shifted. Daytime calls fading, replaced by the strange clicks and cries of night creatures. The fading light worried Laura. Night in these woods belonged to hunters far worse than the beast they had seen. She opened her mouth to warn him, but before she could speak, Evan slowed and raised a hand. They froze. Somewhere ahead, faint voices drifted through the trees. They were low and guttural, speaking a language Laura recognized. Her heart sank. The voices belonged to the Trapper clan. Men who took what they caught to the black markets. If they found them now, the chains Evan had broken would only be replaced with worse. Evan glanced between the two women, reading their expressions. Without asking, he motioned for them to follow. Him off the trail, they moved through thick underbrush. The wet leaves muffling their footsteps. He found a hollow space beneath a fallen tree and gestured for them to crawl inside. Sirai went first, then Laura, and finally, Evan crouched low to fit in beside them. The voices grew louder as the trappers passed nearby. Laura could see them through a gap in the roots, 4 men, armed with crude rifles and nets. One carried a strange device that clicked with every step. A tracker, she realized. One that could detect movement or heat. She held her breath, praying the hollow was deep enough to hide them. Evan's hand rested lightly on the grip of his blaster. If the men found them, there would be no time to run. Sarai's fingers curled into the dirt, her body trembling as the footsteps came closer. The tracker clicked faster now, its light blinking in the dim forest. One of the men turned toward their hiding spot. Evan's eyes met Laura's for the briefest moment. In that look, she saw something she didn't expect. A silent promise. Whatever happened, go. He would stand between them and danger. The man took a step closer, raising his rifle. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, a loud roar split the air. It was the beast. The men froze, glancing at each other. The leader cursed under his breath and barked an order. In an instant, they turned and hurried in the opposite direction. The sound of their footsteps faded, swallowed by the night. They stayed in the hollow for a while longer. No one spoke. Only the faint sound of their breathing filled the space. When Evan finally signaled it was safe, they crawled out into the cool night air. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier, but the danger had passed. At least for the moment, Sirai leaned against the fallen tree, her voice low. They would have taken us, she said, the words heavy with truth. Evan nodded once, his face unreadable. Laura stepped closer to him, searching for the right words. You. Protect. Why? She asked slowly. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in halting words, I lost someone. Long time ago. I not. Let happen again. The sincerity in his voice was like a weight in the air. Laura didn't fully understand his story, but she understood the meaning. It was not about payment or reward. It was about a promise he had made long before meeting them. They started moving again, slower now. The forest thinned ahead, the trees giving way to faint light. Laura realized they were approaching a hidden path, one she had only heard of in whispered stories, a path that led to her people's secret settlement. Her heart pounded. If they brought him there, the elders might not see him as a savior. But as a threat, Evan seemed to sense her hesitation. He stopped and looked at both women, his voice firm but quiet. I help you until safe. No matter where, he said. The words were clumsy, but the intent was clear. Sirai met Laura's gaze, and without speaking, they both knew what they had to decide. The choice was not simple. They could leave him here, return home, and avoid the wrath of their elders, or they could take him with them, risking everything but honoring the promise they felt in his actions. Laura's throat felt tight as she finally spoke. You? Come. With us, she said, the words slow but steady. Evan nodded once. No smile, no relief, only quiet acceptance. And in that moment, a silent pact was formed between them, a promise in the forest, made not with words, but with trust. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. The hidden path wound between ancient trees. Their trunks were wide enough to swallow a house, their roots curling like the claws of sleeping giants. Evan walked behind Laura and Sci-Fi now. Letting them lead, his boots made little sound on the mossy ground, but every step carried the weight of uncertainty. He knew they were close to something important, though he didn't know what. The air grew warmer as they moved forward. Faint lights appeared ahead, flickering between the branches. Like fireflies, the smell of cooking herbs and burning wood reached them. Laura's chest tightened. They were home. But this was not the return she had imagined. She glanced at Sci-Fi, who gave a weak smile. Though her eyes were full of worry, the settlement appeared suddenly, hidden behind walls of woven branches. And stone at the gates stood two tall guards. Their armor made of layered bark and metal. Their weapons were sharp, their stares sharper. They looked first at Laura and Sci-Fi with surprise, then at the human with open suspicion. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand for them to stop. "Who is this?" the guard demanded in their language. Laura hesitated, then answered quietly, "He saved us." The guard's eyes narrowed. "No human enters here," he said, voice hard as stone. Evan didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. The rejection, the distrust. Sci-Fi stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "Without him, we would be dead," she said. The guards exchanged glances. Clearly unconvinced, one reached for his horn, ready to call the elders. The sound would bring not just leaders, but judgment. Minutes later, the elders arrived, tall figures draped in heavy robes. Their faces marked with the lines of age and authority, the eldest among them. A woman with eyes like polished obsidian stepped forward. Her gaze swept over Laura and Sci-Fi, softening for a brief moment before turning to Evan. "You brought a human into our heart," she said coldly. "Do you know what that means?" Laura swallowed hard. "It means we live," she answered. Murmur spread among the gathered crowd. The elder raised a hand for silence. Her eyes never leaving Laura's. "Explain," she commanded. So Laura told the story. The rusted trap, the poisoned spikes, the beast's golden eyes. Sci-Fi added her own voice, speaking of the way he fought without hesitation. Of the medicine that stopped the venom. Every word was weighed in the air, every detail examined. The crowd shifted, some frowning, others nodding slowly. Evan stood, silent through it all, his eyes moving between faces he could not understand. When they finished, the elder turned to the assembly. "By our law, no human may walk our lands," she said, "but there is another law. Older still, one who saves 2 lives becomes part of the tribe." The words struck the crowd like a wave. Some protested, others looked away, unwilling to defy the ancient rule. The elder stepped closer to Evan. She studied him in silence, as though searching for any trace of deceit. Finally, she spoke, her voice lower. "You do not know our ways, human, but you have fulfilled one of our oldest bonds." She reached into her robe and pulled out a thin braid of silver and green thread. "This marks you as kin," she said. Evan looked at Laura in confusion. She took the braid from the elders' hands and tied it around his wrist. Her voice was soft as she translated, "You are one of us now?" He looked down at the braid, then back at her, his eyes reflecting a rare, quiet warmth. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some still wary, but none daring to break the law. Sci-Fi leaned on Laura's shoulder, her smile small but real. Evan glanced at both of them, his lips pressing into a faint smile of his own. It wasn't joy exactly. It was something heavier. Something like relief, for the first time in a long while. He wasn't alone. Later, as night settled over the settlement, The three of them stood at the edge of the wall. Beyond it lay the dark forest, full of dangers they had faced together. Laura turned to him. "You saved us," she said simply. Evan shook his head. "We saved each other," he replied in slow, careful words. The meaning was clear, even without perfect language. Above them, the stars glimmered between the branches. The forest seemed quieter now, as if recognizing the promise made in its shadow. Whatever came next, whether danger or peace, they would face it together, and deep in his heart, Evan knew this was not the end of their story, but the beginning.